Now for today's entertainment, delighted to welcome back Philip Hancock, who will talk on Murdering the Orient Express.
Thank you very much. Can I just clarify that I won't be talking on Murdering the Orient Express. I will be murdering the Orient Express with my usual inability to string two sentences together sometimes when I do these talks. But yes, Murdering the Orient Express, meandering ramblings about a train I once travelled on. I would assume that for many of you here, the Orient Express is a familiar topic or a familiar subject for me to talk about. It's probably next to the Titanic, though slightly more in a more successful way, the most famous and well-known mode of transport ever to grace the Northern Hemisphere. It has a history and a reputation that I think, well, I know spans at least, to the 1900s. It's a train that we associate. It's not just a train. It's a culture text that we associate with glamour. We associate with murder, sophistication, intrigue, and not a lack of seduction, I think. It's something that we also associate with splendor, with luxury, with ostentation. It is something that is perched in our imaginations. It's a mystery as well as something that is so familiar to us. Mainly it's a mystery because most of us, I don't know if anybody else here has, have never had the opportunity to partake in its intrigue and its luxury and basically just to sit on a train for sort of 48 to 72 hours in such an incredible environment. Most of us, if we are familiar with the train, of course, will be familiar, as I say, with it as something that has permeated our culture, both as a subject of literature, subject of cinema, and not often understood as its own subgenre. So there's a lot of literature out there that has took the Orient Express as a context within which other things may happen. So the case of the body of the Orient Express, Murder on the Christmas Express, a particular favourite of my own, Murder on the Interstellar Express. And I have to say, my own favourite, death. And as somebody who lives in East Anglia, believe you me, I have suffered death on that train many times. Particularly when those words appear on the timetable. Bus replacement service. So the Orient Express is something I think is probably familiar to many of us here. However, what I want to do is talk a little bit about its history, a little bit about its progression as something which has become integral to a sense of sort of European culture, of European achievement, and as well something that for me is very personal, having very fortunately spent a couple of days on what might be considered the modern inheritor of the Orient Express tradition. Something's missing. Okay, we have some slides missing, but never mind. That is actually a slide, I'll tell you what it is, I'll go back. That is actually a slide of an American steam train. And why is there a picture of an American steam train? Because considering that the Orient Express is something that is so closely associated with European culture, its origins actually can be found in the New World. Anybody know who this man is? So this is Georges Nagelmacher. Georges Nagelmacher was a Belgian banker who was fascinated with trains. In fact, he was a banker, but Nagelmacher is one of the oldest private banks, in Belgium, who, as so many characters who inhabit these kind of stories, at a very young age, disappointed his parents. Because they wanted him to become a banker, but he actually wanted to become an engineer and went to university to study civil engineering. And during this time he became fascinated, perhaps not unsurprisingly, with trains, as these were considered to be at the forefront of modern technology. In 1869, the young George committed something of a sin in terms of, he was from a big Catholic family. He fell in love with his cousin. He wanted to marry her. This was considered completely inappropriate. So as a way of dealing with the situation, his father, say a wealthy banker, sent him to America to try and both mend his broken heart and generally get him out of the way of trouble. There he found himself embroiled in the world of American steam trains. In particular, in that year, he found himself in Omaha, where the transcontinental railway line had just been completed. So basically what had happened was that the two train systems from the east and west of the United States had finally been joined in the middle, effectively meaning that one could travel safely without having going to sea. And I think it was about 12 days from one coast of the United States to the other. And he was fascinated by this. And he was thinking, well, look, this is America, okay, this is maybe the land of opportunity, but I'm European, why can't we do this across the European continent? He was also, actually, if I go back a second, you'll see fascinated by something else. We'll see there, if we just look a little bit further down, that these trains featured the Pullman Palace sleeping car. In America, because of the vast distances they had to cross, a guy called George Pullman had introduced sleeping cars, something that at that point hadn't been seen to any great extent across the European continent, because basically people didn't travel those kinds of distances. Now, Pullman himself is an interesting character. I don't know if anybody of you know about the work of Pullman. A lot of people think of Pullman as being a European company, but actually George Pullman introduced what were basically cattle cars with bunks in them. But as the late century developed, he started to develop particularly unique forms of sleeping carriages. So maybe familiar with this, as Edward said, the ability to turn individual sitting carriages into sleeping carriages. So the Pullman carriage was a way in which middle class and upper class passengers could cross the American continent in relative comfort. The other problem with Pullman, of course, was he also exploited African-American labour quite extensively. And it was an interesting situation to actually be a Pullman boy, as they used to call them, unfortunately, was considered to be quite a high-status job amongst the African-American community. But at the same time, he paid them relatively little, very little in the way of any kind of breaks or holidays. It was very much the American capital model. But nonetheless, Nagelmacher was incredibly impressed by this. He hadn't seen anything like this in Europe, and he wanted to try and replicate both the idea of the transcontinental railway alongside the production of, or the use of sleeping carriages to make this a feasible operation. Now, in 1876, I think it was 1876, Nagelmacher's he founded the International der Wagon, well, it's actually the International der Wagon League, effectively the international sleeping car company. This became a roaring success. He spent about the next 10 years developing, refining. I'm not a railway buff, but redefining levels of comfort, increasing the gauge of the carriages, improving the stability of the carriages, and ensuring that actually people for the first time ever could get a good night's sleep on a carriage crossing continental Europe. And this was a company that became increasingly renowned for its services across parts of Europe. But as we're obviously going to reach now, the most famous and certainly the most renowned of these was to become the Orient Express. This train made its inaugural run, having tried to do this in 1880, but had been cancelled due to technical difficulties. In 1883, he managed to get a train to take passengers from Paris to Varna in Bulgaria. Now, obviously, the Orient Express, the anticipated route at that stage was from Paris to Constantinople, as we know now, Istanbul. This took him 2 years in order to negotiate a whole range of international treaties to allow him both to use individual rail tracks and to cross international borders. He went to Varna because at that point there was no way he could get agreement to take a train into Istanbul, Constantinople it was. So at Varna they had to get on a ferry and take that to Istanbul. But nonetheless, it was a success. The journey itself, there's a lovely story that the journey itself was beset by a whole range of anticipations and fears. So whether this is true or not, I don't know. There's a lot of mythology around the first run back in the 19th century, but passengers were less concerned with having their tickets than carrying revolvers because of the fear of hijacking and the fear of kidnapping and various other things. And actually on this inaugural journey, when he reached Bulgaria, he hired a group of actors to actually come onto the train to pretend to rob the passengers. Very good idea. which given the fact that he'd already advised them to carry revolvers, was slightly concerning. What I do like is the fact that apparently about halfway through this, they suddenly started singing and dancing and were actually put on a show for the passengers, and they provided music for the rest of the night. But I think probably they're just relieved that they all got out of it alive. The service itself was very basic at the first instance. The food and provisions were really just packed in. We were just packed into a storage cabinet. There was the equivalent of sandwiches and coffee and tea. Really, very little more than that. Nonetheless, it was a success. There were 25 passengers on that original journey, including the French correspondents for the Times. And so much hinged on the report that this correspondent brought back. And it wrote a glowing report, said it was a fantastic experience. And from that point on, there were some other problems, small bankruptcies and other things as he went along. But, he found his way through as an incredible entrepreneur, grew the service until it became what we might know today. There was the addition, particularly of dining cars, kitchens, the use of increasingly liveried waiting staff, until, in a sense, it became the pinnacle of luxury for crossing the European continent. And indeed, by the 1900s, it had become a legend in its own immaculately served lunchtime. The original cars, as we can see from here, were actually teak. Now, this surprised me when I found out what the wood was, but they were at the height of luxury. Dinners, dining cars, as you can see there. And this is a slightly later version. This has electric lighting. The original ones had gas lighting. They had heating. As I said, they had also like a double suspension. And more recently, of course, they became associated, and I explain the difference between these carriages at the moment, with the blue livery of the Venice Simplon Orient Express. That's just an image. This was sort of going back to the original dining carriages. Now, one thing that's interesting about, I think, the Orient Express is that we talk about the Orient Express in the singular. But in fact, there were several Orient Expresses at various points in history. The original, do we have it? There we go. So the original 1883-1914 route took it predominantly across the Germanic lands, through Vienna, Budapest, Bucharest, and as I say, down to Varna, where there was a ferry crossing over to Istanbul. Within 2 years, that had become a land route. Now this of course was particularly problematic because in those days there wasn't a single German. The German Empire, as many of you will know, was a collection of states, each with their own individual railway companies. So just to get across what we now would see as one country required negotiation, I think, of 10 different contracts. However, that all changed, almost changed, in, I've got the exact date now, I think it was 1909? 1906, with the opening of what at the time was the largest tunnel in the world, which was the Simplon Tunnel. The Simplon Tunnel, actually, there was already a passageway across the Alps at that point, which was actually originally a Roman crossing, used to move troops and supplies through into the northern part of the empire. But as I say, in 1909, the tunnel was built under the Alps, and as I say, was an amazing feat of engineering at the time. And this is something that Degelmacher was particularly keen to exploit. However, the problem was, by the time he did it, there was a slight inconvenience in the form of the First World War, which left the use of the Simplon until 1914. But the Simplon tunnel changed the nature and what we probably have as our popular imagination of the Orient Express. As you see, we now take a route through Paris, down to the south, Milan, Venice, Belgrade, Sofia, into Istanbul. And that just takes me back, as again, I'll just... So as you can see now, that makes sense that what we have there are the original T carriages of the original Orient Express. And we can see the route there from Vienna, Budapest and Bucharest. And the blue carriages, which become synonymous with what in its day was called the Simplon Orient Express, which took that particular route. Some of you, I think most of us are probably more familiar with that variant by virtue of the Agatha Christie Murdering the Orient Express, which we'll talk about it some more in a moment. There was another route, of course, which actually was important, which was what's often called the Olberg. And again, historically, this is also important. The Olberg Express, which comes through Paris, Zurich, Innsbruck, Vienna, and actually came down to Athens. So a lot of people actually, to paraphrase an old Cockney accent, not a lot of people tend to know this, but again, there was a third route that was operated. The last one I just want to mention of any significance is what is known as the Venice Simplon Orient Express, which I'll talk about more towards the end, as this is the one that I've had experience of. This was, as you can see, a modern variation, 1982. It says to 2005, that's actually inaccurate, it's still running. And this is really the tourist train that we know today. I won't really talk about this one. This is the one. This is the OBB is what is left, or what was left of the Orient Express until 2009, which really was a standard overnight sleeper that ran from Paris to Vienna. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So the Orient Express is, in many ways, I think, and this is why I'm kind of interested in this, it's an idea. When we talk about the Orient Express, as I say, it's not a single train, it's not a single journey, it's not a single route. It is an idea of luxury.
You stand on that side, buddy.
Otherwise you're off camera.
Best thing, probably. It's an idea. It is, as I've said, this phrase that we used to use when I used to teach media studies, a culture text. Now, the train itself, of course, in reality, leaving aside the sort of the fictional portrayal, be it Norwich, be it Interstellar, be it Murder of multiple souls, has become associated with a range of very famous passengers. Many of them associated, of course, with intrigue, as I say, with espionage, with certain forms of nefarious activities, shall we say. The train was very famous, of course, for a place where powerful men, predominantly men, would meet their mistresses, particularly if they were members of royal families and royal dynasties across Europe. But perhaps most importantly is its association with espionage. Perhaps the most famous passenger in this respect was the Dutch-born German spy Matahari. But I think one that might be of more interest in is this gentleman. Does anybody recognise? Baden-Powell, absolutely, yes. War hero and purveyor of the finest woggle in town.
He's not even wearing a woggle.
He's not wearing a woggle, is he? No, he's de-woggled in this.
Cool hats. Like a mule kick.
Yeah. Baden-Powell was, pre-First World War, was a regular passenger in the early 20th century on the Orient Express, mainly passing as a... Now, I may have got this wrong. Lepidopteris? Butterflies?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. He was a butterfly collector. And he used to get off at various stops, especially around the Balkans. Always good to get off around the Balkans. And he would sketch butterflies. Rare examples that he would find in this particular part of Central Eastern Europe. Of course, it was only after his death that he was exposed to what he was actually doing was sketching military installations and encoding these into the wings of the butterflies, which I think is quite impressive.
ChatGPT will never do that.
I know. Absolutely. Mind you, well, he would do, but it would just take you in completely the wrong direction, the wrong way. So Baden-Powell. Another famous story is, does anybody, if anybody recognises this, I shall just sit down and be quiet at this point. Anybody recognise this gentleman?
Rory a kid here, isn't
looks a bit like my dad, actually. And this is King Boris III of Bulgaria. Obviously, his father was King Ferdinand the something or other, and both he and his father were great train enthusiasts. Boris, however, took it to the extreme that whenever the Orient Express came through Bulgaria, which, as you saw from the maps, it frequently did, particularly in the traditional route, he would insist on it stopping so he could then take the... What do you do on a train? Take the bridge, take the plate, I assume it would be. You would take the plate. Which was a source of some concern, let me say, to the driver and engineer. There's a lovely video, there's a lovely documentary on this where they actually portray this, whereby it's one of these historical inaccuracies, but you actually have him on the plate speeding the train up while Nadelmarker is actually there, which wouldn't have actually crossed over. And Nadelmarker saying, could you slow the train down? At which point his bodyguard of security just pulls out a sort of a flintlock and puts it to his head. That's Nadelmarker, not the king. Which is obviously nonsense because this was taking place in the 1930s and Nadelmarker wasn't around by that point. But I don't want to go into too much detail. But there is a story that in I can remember my dates correct here, that was in 1934, that he was at the plate and the train was late. And there was no way that Boris here would allow the train to fall behind schedule. So he whatever you do with the train, he opened her up to such an extent that the boiler was starting to expand. There were problems and it was reaching its levels of tolerance. To which point he insisted that the engineer, or fireman would he be? Fireman engineer, opened the furnace, the boiler door to pile in more wood. So this is really not a good idea. To which I assume then somebody said, he's the king, you'll do what you're told. To which the fireman opened the door, immediately caught fire. Boris immediately jumped into action, kicking him off the footplate to burn alive as the train thundered on. To which he apparently said, well, the train was in on time on my watch. Now, whether or not the Bulgarian crown paid any compensation or how much they paid in compensation to the fireman's family is unknown, but needless to say, he was never allowed near the footplate of the Orient Express again. And perhaps the most famous historical association is, in this case, well, two historical associations. And wait for the next slide because I have managed to do it, of course. Is the surrender of the German forces in 1918 to, oh God, what was his rank? Foch. What was he? Was he Field Marshal? Field Marshal Foch. Anyway, we'll go with that one. That'll go. To Field Marshal Foch, where the Germans were forced to sign surrender on the coach. Have I got the number here? Yes, coach 2419 of the original Orient Express. In itself, an interesting historical anecdote, I think. However, I have Nazis.
Finest tradition.
Mark to the sequel.
Mark to the sickle. So we have, exactly. There he is, the deeply unpleasant man himself. That, of course, in 1940, the tables were turned when Hitler insisted that the same carriage at the same location was used to receive the French surrender. There was a man in Trumpian mode that clearly appreciated the dramatic. The carriage was then taken to Berlin, where it was put on display. However, in 1945, again, we may not be surprised at this in terms of his particular temperament, when it was clear that Germany was losing the war, Hitler personally instructed the carriage to be destroyed, so that the same humiliation could not be brought down upon the Nazi German regime. So in that sense, one of the most interesting pivotal moments that one of the carriages from the original Orient Express played. Now, it's probably fair to say, I'm going to skip over a lot of history here now, but by the post-war years, the Orient Express had largely fallen out of favour with passengers. It was expensive, it was being supplanted by jet transport, which of course would now open up borders in the same way that the Orient Express once did. And it never regained its kudos and its attraction. I mean, and of course it was a death, as you can imagine, by 1,000 cuts. First of all, they removed the dining carriages. Then they removed sleeping carriages. The routes were truncated. The route to Istanbul never actually was reinstated. And ultimately, the real kind of slight to the legacy of the train was they had the audacity to introduce standard class carriages. So ordinary working people started to use the train as a commuting service. The last Paris to Istanbul service, which only ran very irregularly, I say it was stopped, it did run, but it did run very irregularly, finally ran in 1977. And the majority of the carriages were either auctioned off or left to rot, as we can see here, from one of the simpler trains. And ultimately, the service disappeared from the timetables in about 2009. So I think it's fair to say the real heyday of the service was in the 1920s and 1930s, but it did manage to struggle on into the 1950s and even into the 1970s and 2000s. Today, the name continues to exist in the form, well, two forms really. The first is the Venice Simplon Orient Express. This, as I noted earlier, was the, it was actually originally started in the 1980s as basically a tourist service. It's now owned by Belmont and runs not just to Venice, but also to a range of European destinations. Infrequently, it's not a timetable service in the way that we might imagine, but it has become in itself something of a cult service that is considered a luxury item. Interestingly, more recently, there has emerged something called Accor, the hotel and leisure chain, have also claimed the name Orient Express, which they can do, and they are running services under the name of Orient Express the Dolce Vita, which predominantly tour. Well, I say they predominantly tour, they haven't yet. So they were supposed to start running in 2004, they're supposed to run this year, and they're now talking about 2006. And this is using restored carriages, but with an updated Art Deco feel. And I'll talk about the Venice Simplon in a few moments. So there are now currently 2 Orient Expresses running. Now, a little bit about my own experience of the Orient Express. So in 2020, I should remember, 2022, of course it was. I was very lucky to spend my 25th wedding anniversary on the Orient Express with my wife, Melissa, who you can see to my right, and two very old friends who were also married in the same years, 25 years. It was one of those journeys that, I have to be honest with you, in many respects was potentially a bit of a caricature of the Orient Express, but nonetheless was an incredible experience as a piece of luxury restoration of the idea surrounding it. Now, what Belmont have done, of course, is because they've been able to do this, is run it from London, initially as part of the Pullman service, the Belmont Pullman service. So there we are, stood outside there. The Phoenix is a carriage there, Ione is a carriage that we were in. We were very, very lucky because for 6 months prior to our journey in the October of 2022, they'd had to stop this because of Brexit. So Brexit regulations around passport and custom control had meant that actually people were finding themselves taking a Eurostar to Paris. Albeit first class. However, I don't know about you, but I think dressing like that on the Eurostar may still turn a few heads. We were lucky. There was a small window where they reintroduced the London Pullman. Now again, unfortunately, that has now been cut from e-service. So if you do take the train, you have to get a Eurostar to Paris to pick it up. Which as I'll talk about, is a real shame because actually so much of the experience, the anticipation coming through the Pullman and then onto the actual Orient Express itself is very much part of the magic of the whole thing, if you want to put it like this. So the train itself, starting on the Pullman. I don't know if it's been on the. Has anyone been on the Pullman in the UK? You have, yeah. Yes, you experienced that. Beautiful train. I mean, absolutely stunning. Service, food, everything. Multiple carriages, incredible marquetry. Everything about it was just incredibly special. The trouble is, of course, you go to the Orient Express, you know there's food ahead of you, but you still have to start with the 5-course meal. No more food. But I was very pleased with the fact they also had the wonderful liberty. Everything was just absolutely stunning. You see, every carriage was different. Most of these carriages, of course, were, as I say, reconditioned from the 1930s. It's interesting that I tend to think of the Pullman very much as a British tradition. Of course, as I say, the Pullman itself was an American invention. What happened there was, of course, by the fact that Nagelmacher managed to corner the market in European sleeper carriages, that Pullman, having given him the idea, then found himself restricted to the United States and to the UK. These Pullman carriages obviously weren't sleepers. It was a day journey down to Dover, but absolutely stunning. Absolutely stunning. The marquetry, the use of original materials to restore these carriages, absolutely incredible. As I say, 5-course meal, service, everything more than you could ask for. The only bit that probably spoils it a little bit is that, as I say, you get to Dover. You then have to go through passport control, which means we spend about an hour in the sort of the Dover shopping centre, which gave me one of those wonderful moments, of course, when this chap sort of wandered over to me there. I was stood in suit and hat and whatever. I think I was outside Greg's or somewhere. And he comes up to me. He says, he's done his best. He looks good. He's certainly put an effort in, made the effort. And he comes to me and says, I'll keep it polite, but he said something along the lines of, God, don't we look a couple of wallies dressed like this? And I looked and I thought, actually, I usually dress like this. To which point he looked me up and down, turned back at his wife and just walked sharply off. I just done that.
Oh, you just ended the show.
That's all right, there we go. Nonetheless, superb. We then put on a luxury coach, more champagne, the best peanuts I've ever had in my life. Wonderful peanuts, more champagne. I don't like to do this too much because but the champagne was flowing throughout the journey. Absolutely stunning. We are welcomed at Calais by that site, which I have to say is absolutely stunning when you first see them. The original Compagnia International, their wagon lead carriages, all restored from original 1920s and 1930s stock. Now, as I say, there's a little bit of a caricature, there's a little bit of Disney about it. It is a tourist experience. You know, I will put this into context in a few moments when I talk about the bar, but generally speaking, everybody on that train wasn't going anywhere, particularly what they were doing was they were experiencing the train. But an absolutely incredible experience. Welcomed by our host. I can't remember her name, I feel terrible, so I'll call her Michelle because she was a very French individual. She was fantastic, she was absolutely stunning, absolutely incredible out of the service. Of course, every carriage has their own attendant, so couldn't do too much. Champagne, food, yeah, just stunning, absolutely stunning, immaculate. The train itself is like walking into. It is a time warp. It's a stunning, it's like an experience. And we were led to our own cabin. Now again, as I talked about earlier on, we have the classic Pullman style or later Pullman style cabins. Each contains sofa, small wash basin, washing area. It's interesting when you actually, you can't help but do the TripAdvisor thing, can you? You know, I'm going to do this. Let's go through the TripAdvisor. What are the reviews? There is only one toilet per carriage and there's no shower. There's no air conditioning. Well, actually, there was air conditioning if you knew how to use it. I couldn't get to sleep because it was on a train. But you're right. There was one toilet per carriage, but my God, were they glamorous toilets! The whole thing was again absolutely superb. Even as I say, there was air conditioning, and even the air conditioning was a delight to use. And as I say, the carriages themselves, each carriage has its own history. So we were in 3473, which was a lovely touch because my friend Steve, who was on the journey with us, he was from Birmingham. And as we can see here, the carriage 3473, first class luxe sleeping car built 1929 by it was a Metropolitan Camel Carriage and Wagon Company Limited, Saltley, Birmingham. Most of these carriages had served on various Orient Express routes across Europe, or generally speaking, as we can see on things like what was called the Train Bleu, which was a Northern European wagon lead train, and ultimately, as we can see there, on the simpler Orient Express. There were other, slightly more obvious to the same thing. A frieze of zigzagging flower gardens designed by the English designer Morrison. This was the kind of detail in each cabin. I mean, the marquetry was absolutely unbelievable. The trouble, of course, is I haven't got many photographs because the reflection of the polished wood was almost impossible to deal with. It was just absolutely stunning. The carriages themselves, you may have noted when you look at the Pullmans, the increased width and increased gauge that Nagelmarker had insisted became one of the characteristic features of the train. But again, each restaurant carriage had its own interior design. And what was beautiful was between sittings for dinner, there were board games laid out, there were drinks served across the train. It was quite stunning. Some more examples of some of the dining cars on the train. Perhaps, of course, the most important is the bar. I don't remember actually what I should remember this, but I can't remember. It's 3674. This is the piano bar of the Orient Express. It is again a stunning space. I'm still not sure why they only have one bar on the Orient Express. It does seem to me that is something that's probably needed. A certain degree of expansion in their facilities, but yeah, it was incredible. This is where we obviously has cocktails before dinner, and I show these pictures purely to, first of all, reinforce the fact that some of us made sure that we upheld the correct sartorial standards for our journey. This was predominantly, so when we left Calais, we had pre-dinner drinks and lunch before we arrived at Paris. perhaps the only real cultural shock, therefore, was arriving in Paris. Now, I'm a bit of a Europhile, and I consider the French to be an elegant and well-dressed, sartorially tasteful nation and culture. Yet, for some bizarre reason, when we arrived in Paris, we were invaded, and I use that word loosely, by people who seemed to be using the train as a standard commuter service. Given the fact that on average from Paris to Venice was going to cost them somewhere in the region of about £9,000 to £10,000 a person, we were somewhat taken aback by people on laptops having business meetings over agendas and working on their phones, and clearly not dressing for the occasion. This was only countered, I have to say, later on in the evening, by the fact that around the table a group of English passengers, who I would say were probably slightly worse for wear, convinced the pianist to start playing, I think it was Kylie Minogue, or certainly what might consider, coming from Essex, good Essex sing-along songs for the rest of the evening. Which I have to say, normally I may have objected to, but the fact they got rid of all the bloody Parisians out to keep that. So I was quite pleased about that. Fantastic evening. When we returned to our rooms, they had already been made up. Now, actually, that isn't a picture of our room because I couldn't get a decent photo from from that angle, but it was amazing. You came back, everything had been tidied, and as I say, the conversion had taken place. I did, of course, get the short straw. It had to be on the top bunk, and I never realised until that point how scared I could become sleeping on the top bunk of a train. Because, of course, the whole journey, we were pulled by diesel in a similar vein to the original Orient Express. Of course, at national borders, we had to change engines. So we were pulled by diesel trains. There was no room for the romance of steam, unfortunately, on this journey. But it was amazing. After about the hours of about 1 o'clock in the morning, the speed the thing picked up. And I found myself waking up at about 2 or 3 in the morning, literally clinging onto the side, sweating. And you know that kind of childlike fear that suddenly grips you sometime when you're thinking, we're going to crash, you know. And there's a little voice going, no, don't be ridiculous. Grow up, man. You know, I was scared, I want to get off, and you know. So it was an interesting experience. My wife, who was in the bottom bunk, had a perfect night's sleep because I was terrified. Nonetheless, it was an experience. And of course, we had then pretty much the rest of a full day on the train. Now, there's lots I would like to tell you about this, but I think there is one thing I have to emphasise. Food. The food keeps coming. So, breakfast, relatively light fruit, scones, pastries, tea, coffee, followed by lunch about 2 hours later. In the Oriental restaurant, absolutely again, 5-course meal, champagne, wine, followed by, I have to say there is a slight break here, a journey to the gift shop. Yes, it has a gift shop. Now, unfortunately, I'm wearing a linen shirt tonight without cufflinks, but normally I would wear my leek cufflinks that was purchased. But you can buy pretty much anything you want. We have spoons, we have cufflinks, we have badge. Now, the badge, of course, is an interesting one because this is the service badge of the VSOE staff. So it's not actually a tourist thing. You have to go to one of the stewards and say, can you get me a couple of badges? Which seemed like a good idea at the time. We arrive in Venice eventually, but my friend Steve, he decided he would wear his proudly around Venice, to where he just kept finding something, oh, you work on the Orient Express? No, I was a passenger, but anyway. But these are the badges. Teddy bears, God knows, but wonderful. And actually one of the best salespeople I've ever met for a long time. I think we spent more in the gift shop than we did on the actual train. Of course, then followed by afternoon tea. Just to make sure. We arrive in Venice. Again, we are ushered to a private water taxi and taken to our hotel. And it is one of the few times in my life, I think the closest I've ever come to this in terms of nightmares was when I did a parachute jump at 20. And ironically, I didn't have the nightmares before I did the jump. I had the nightmares after I'd done the jump. But I remember for about a week afterwards, waking up in a cold sweat, thinking that it was all over. And indeed it was. because one really felt, despite the fact that it's a tourist experience and it's I mean, some people are very damning of the fact, oh, it's full of people dressed like it's the 1920s and 1930s. Well, you know,
What's wrong with
well,
that?
my word, you know, one of the few occasions where I've actually felt comfortable on a train dressed like this, you know, so, especially if I've been on the Norwich Express and I'm just slightly nervous about what might happen to me at any point in time. But it really was an absolute real sense of the history of those carriages, the history of that train. So, if anybody is ever fortunate, and I understand, fortunate enough, it was, for me, personally, it was a once in a lifetime. Well, I say it's a once in a lifetime, and I may slightly modify that in a second. Once in a lifetime event, then grasp it, take it. The history of the train itself, I think, is emblematic of the rise of modern Europe, and in itself, it is a celebration of modernity. There's no doubt about it. It's the kind of modernity that we like. I remember, I think Luca last week was talking about modern. We're against the modern. I think most of us actually are often embrace a particular type of modernity, a more stylish and more cultured and more refined notion of modernity. And I think the train epitomises it. Now I say, of course, that it was a once in a lifetime. Last week I had a particularly large birthday, the kind of birthday one tries to ignore and forget. All I can say is that tonight I managed to travel in on my senior rail card, so that was a nice bonus. Only to find that once again my incredible wife and my two friends who now live in the depths of Cornwall, no disrespect, the Cornwall chapter had appeared. Well, they appeared, much to my surprise, and arranged just to take the Pullman down to Dover, and beautifully we were seated once again on the Ione carriage. Again, if you know the Orient Express, if you can't do that, I really would recommend if you're able to do it, to take the Bellman Pullman and just eat yourself stupid and just enjoy the ambience and the. Well, as I say that, the only thing I was going to, we stopped at Dover, and there was that moment at which I got off the train, and some guy, it's one of those moments where all these elegant people walk off, and there's some guy with a shirt hanging out on the phone saying, yeah, well, it's her bloody fault, she's made me come on this stupid train for the day, which was a little bit of a shame. But generally speaking, it's a beautiful experience. The staff are superb, the food is superb, and yeah, it's something that I would heartily recommend. But the train itself has a history that is fascinating. There's some great videos out there, some very interesting books, and I would recommend anybody who has the opportunity, at least, to read and understand the complexities. And I haven't gone into the complexities of negotiations, and I'm not into trains hugely, but the technical aspects of making something like this work at a time when nothing like it had been seen across Europe. And that's me finished. Thank you very much.
Well, any questions? Any questions?
No.
Not a single.
Well, this isn't a question as such. I had the pleasure of visiting Constantinople a few years ago, and there's still the terminus there. It's now been turned into, I think, a sort of suburban sort of metro station or sort of a regular train station. But there is a dining room there, so there's, you know, if one wants to still find the relics of sort of what was once the Orient Express, it is still available to find. But sadly, the train no longer goes there. It's not quite the same level of romance. You'd very much recommend it then.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, you're right. I mean, there are traces. So Budapest, there's a railway museum in Budapest which has one of the original teak carriages, and also has one of the original steam engines. Well, again, I'm not an engine person. You know, one of the ones that was powerful enough to pull the whole train. And I think there's a couple in Germany as well that still exist. Not one they blew up, obviously. But yeah, so yeah, they do still exist. There are remnants of it. I'm going to say all the carriages on the Venice Simplon that exists now are all original. I mean, that has all been refurbished. But yeah, I mean, if you can, And I understand that not everybody can, and I was very lucky to be able to do it for that time. But yeah, it is worth it. I mean, I think for people like us who appreciate that and don't mind a little bit of the play acting that goes along with it, you know. I mean, it's amazing when you do read these reviews of people. Oh, you know, it's Disney on tracks. Well, it's not Disney on tracks, but yeah, of course, there's an element where people dress up and try to relive something.
Yeah.
But that's fine, you know. Who are we to criticise something like that? No, it is worth it.
Does it still run to Istanbul at all?
No, yeah, the VSOE does occasionally run to us. So the regular services to Venice, and it does kind of like special runs, perhaps once or twice a year. And I think one does go through to Istanbul. But it's I've got to know how much that costs. You know, that was I'm getting off at Venice. Thank you very much.
There were lots of train clubs over in the 70s, and you could travel on the old Pullmans, and you could travel just a few, like 10 miles or so, and travel in those so you could dress up. But I also used to travel on the old Norwich Express.
The Norwich Express?
Yeah,
wow.
I was born in Norwich, and it went from Norwich to Yarmouth and Norwich to Crumlin. But it was a steam train, and it was wooden, it was quite beautiful, and it was it's quite a journey. It took about, I think, 40 minutes an hour to get to Cromwell or something like that. But they were beautiful trains.
There are a number of these around. So, I mean, there's the Northern Bell, which has taken British Rail Mark II, or whatever they might be called, standard carriages, and reinvented them to look like Pullmans. But again, often that's pulled by steam train. I mean, the sad thing about, well, not sad, but the thing about the journey I did last week on my birthday was that was supposed to be a steam train, but apparently it was too hot to have a steam train. There were no leaves on the track. We were trying to work out what makes it too hot for a steam train, but there you go. We assumed it might be because of, I don't know whether you couldn't open the windows of the steam train because all
the bloody CFD.
I don't think it was the fact they didn't want soot all over their Michelin star food. But no, there are a few of those. And as you say, there are lots of really good steam trains around the UK, of course. I mean, I actually drove a steam train at the East Anglian Railway Museum, do a little one where you can shunt it up and down the sidings, and that's good fun. The fact that apparently I was the only one they had to slam the emergency brake on for.
I'll just offer one recommendation for anybody who's a devotee of the Orient Express. It's a viewing of Minder on the Orient Express, which is absolutely essential viewing for the discerning viewer. It was filmed in 1985, and whereby the Pullman basically went sort of down to sort of Dover, and then they had to catch a sort of a stellar sea link that basically took you to the continent. They then re-embarked there, but it's I suppose that would be a good way of sort of seeing the way that the whole setup was recreated. But it's anyway, particularly fine example.
I'm trying to remember. Is that the one? Sorry, this is a flashback. Is that the one where the waiter says to Arthur Daly says, "I'll have a vodka and tonic," and Arthur Daly says, the waiter says, "Straight up."
Don't be cheeky. Don't be cheeky, Claude.
I'm like burned into my memory.
Yes, oh yes, that's the one.
Excellent, excellent.
No, it's essential viewing.
Yes.
Are we done then?
Yeah.
On that sophisticated note, thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much.